So I was thinking about capitalism. Specifically, I was thinking about people who reject capitalism, which is puzzling when you consider that there is overwhelming historical data and empirical evidence which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that capitalism generates more wealth, provides more upward mobility, lower class to middle class to rich beyond your wildest dreams, and alleviates more poverty than any other system in the history of humanity. In fact, capitalism does such a good job at alleviating poverty that in just the last few decades alone, thanks to capitalism, half of the poverty in the world has been alleviated. Just a remarkable feat in humanity. But even when capitalism doesn't alleviate poverty, it changes what poverty looks like. For example, take Venezuela, socialist Venezuela. In socialist Venezuela, people are so poor, so hungry, that they have literally resorted to killing zoo animals so that they don't starve to death. And this is true throughout most collectivist countries, whether it's in North Korea, where people are starving to death, whether it was in the Soviet Union, whether it was in China under Mao. Poverty is brutal in these countries. Compare that to what poverty looks like in a capitalist system. Quite different, don't you think? Because in a capitalist system, poverty looks a little bit more like a really fat person waddling out of McDonald's after they had a Big Mac, getting in their car that they own and driving it home to their apartment. You see the difference? See, capitalism allows for human creativity, the generation of wealth, and human innovation, which leads to inventions like smartphones, which leads to Henry Ford's assembly line, which makes cars very affordable, so that even people in poverty could have luxury things, luxury items, such as cars. Capitalism literally changes what poverty looks like. Capitalism inspires someone to start a restaurant, which becomes a fast food restaurant, which, don't get me wrong, it has its problems, but at least it creates a society where people that are in poverty are not starving to death. They're actually, the bigger threat to them is whether or not they'll eat too much and die of a heart attack. A major difference thanks to the freedom provided by capitalism. Now, one of the things you'll hear socialists say is, well, capitalism leads to a great deal of inequality, which there is no doubt. There is no doubt that capitalism creates inequality, but what would you rather have? A system where all people are equal, but they are equally poor in that they're starving to death, like in Venezuela, like in North Korea, or a system where some people like Mark Zuckerberg might become out of this world rich, but along with that, poverty is changing so that people who are in poverty are no longer starving to death. They're actually, like we said, might die because they have too much to eat and are too fat. Inequality isn't a problem if it's changing the floor of what poverty is. Of course, there's also another false implication in that claim by socialists, right? That, well, capitalism creates inequality. Do understand that under all socialist systems, whether it's in Venezuela, the ruling party, the government bureaucrats, the military, which helps keep these rulers in power, they don't starve. In fact, these people live in luxury. Kim Jong-un lives like a god on earth. The power structure, which allows him to stay in power, the military, his bureaucrats, they all have food to eat. They all have luxury. It is the people in these countries who remain in absolute destitute poverty. they are equal in how poor they are, in how hungry they are. While a small ruling class in all of these situations, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's communist China under Mao, the ruling class live absolute lives of luxury. So inequality takes place under all systems, but capitalism is a system which allows for even those who are quote-unquote in poverty to have things that people in these other countries couldn't dream of. So it is very puzzling, we'll say, as to why so many people aren't able to see this. So many people reject capitalism. But then when you think about it, that the government controls the education system, a compulsory education system, which you have no choice but to take part in, well, it begins to make sense. Because if you properly define capitalism, we would define it as property rights, which really just means freedom. Capitalism is the ability to take ownership of goods, property, and services. So if you have a good, if you cut down some wood and you make it into a product, you could sell that product to another person. You're not forcing them to buy it. The transaction is completely voluntary. You can sell your service to another person. They're not forcing you to work for them. The transaction is completely voluntary. So it does make sense that when you think about it, that the government and their education system, we'll call it, would teach people that being free is against their best interest, and giving the government more authority is within their best interest. And one of the ways they do this is through the bending of definitions and branding. So under a capitalist system, because you are free, you're in control of your goods and services. Well, you're in control of your goods and services. People pursue their rational self-interest. Right now, I'm pursuing my irrational self-interest. I make these videos. I take my skill set, which is a pretty in-depth understanding of history and a life devoted to logic, philosophy, and reason, and I use my skill set in an attempt to make a living. This is a rational self-interest. I put my thoughts out there to the world, and I hope that the world rewards that, because they appreciate it, by sending me as little as $1 monthly to www.patreon.com and helping me build my operation. But my actions are within my irrational self-interest. And this is no different than someone who starts a corner convenience store, and they buy all the, they raise some money, and they buy all the products and they put them on the shelves, and they want you to come buy their products because it's within their rational self-interest. If they are successful, they'll make money and they'll be able to live a free and prosperous life. There's nothing nefarious about that. So the school system comes along and they tell people that what capitalism is greed. That it's greedy to want to be successful. That it's greedy to open your convenience store and make money, because after some time, if you take the risks and you open that convenience store, you might start to make a lot of money, and maybe you'll make $1 million, $2 million, maybe you'll invest that money, maybe you'll turn that into $100 million if you're smart enough to do it. And then they'll say, well, look at all of this inequality. Capitalism is greed. Capitalism is immoral. And they try to equate greed with immorality. Now, the definition of greed is a desire to obtain excess wealth, power, or food. So, if you obtain that excess wealth through completely voluntary means, if I have a product, if you guys like my idea so enough that enough of you give me $1 a month, $10 a month, that it starts to become to a point where I make millions of dollars a year, is there anything immoral about what I did? Because the transaction is completely voluntary. If someone starts their convenience store and people show up at the store and buy their products, the entire exchange was voluntary. Is there anything immoral about that? So, obtaining wealth through voluntary means, through free transactions between free people, there's nothing immoral about that. An excess of food, well, I think that comes with wealth. Is it immoral to want to make sure that you have food for yourself and your family? And an excess of power, well, certainly power can be used in an immoral fashion, but there's power in everything we do. When I make these videos, I have the power to change people's minds, the power to influence people. If someone is a teacher, they have power over their students. Now, they can abuse that power, or they can use that power to empower other people. So the very nature of quote-unquote greed is not immoral. You can use your wealth for nefarious reasons. You can use power in a nefarious way. But the very nature of having wealth, power, or food is not immoral. Yet we have been convinced that capitalism, which is just the pursuit of rational self-interest, is greed, and greed is immorality. Even though greed, excess wealth and power, can be obtained through completely voluntary means, and they don't necessarily have to be used for nefarious purposes. So, we're then told that we should reject this impulse of capitalism because greed is immoral, and we should accept forms of collectivism, whether it be socialism, whether it be communism. But of course, socialist systems, communist systems require large amounts of taxation, which you'll never get everyone to agree on. So, socialist systems, communist systems require the initiation of the use of force by government to take people's money, to take their wealth, which is to take their property, and redistribute that property to other people. Now, under the capitalist system that I just outlined, transactions are completely voluntary under true capitalism, not what we have today, crony capitalism. That's moral. But the initiation of force, that is immoral. I would even say anyone advocating for that, for the government to go take other people's property and redistribute it to themselves, that might be greedy, but in the bad sense. But it's not just there. And under these systems, because if you don't want capitalism and you want the government to take over property rights, right? Whether that be healthcare, a government telling a doctor that he has to provide a certain service because if he doesn't provide that service, the government will take his license, take away his livelihood, throw him in jail, whatever it might be. Once again, this involves the initiation of the use of force. So in school, we're taught that altruism is a moral system and that capitalism is immoral. But if you break it down, it's just the opposite. Capitalism is a moral system and altruism is an immoral system. But of course, something else happens under this system of socialism and altruism. If people are not able to pursue their greed or their rational self-interest, which is their desire to, I guess you could say greed, to become rich, to have wealth, to have food, maybe to have power, whatever it might be. Doesn't mean they'll use that power negatively. If the government comes along and is going to tax them to a point where they don't have money to reinvest so that they can't pursue their self-interest, and, well, we could start there, then over time there's going to be less and less innovation, because take someone like Henry Ford and starting the assembly line. If the taxation becomes so burdensome, maybe that doesn't happen, and then poverty, what is poverty, never changes. Poverty remains what it is in Venezuela, people starving to death. Whereas under a system of capitalism and freedom, because it incentivizes human innovation, the level of what poverty is actually changes and improves under systems like capitalism. So not only are altruistic systems immoral and capitalist systems, greed systems, moral, but capitalist systems generate more wealth, provide for more upward mobility, and literally change what the floor of poverty is. A remarkable achievement in human history. But they get people to reject capitalism through sophistry. They convince people that a system of free and voluntary exchanges is immoral, and an altruistic system, which is predicated on the initiation of force, is moral, when of course it's just the opposite. So people think that by eroding capitalism, by voting for socialism and state power, they are curing the ills of society. But the truth is, society's ills can all be traced back to a lack of morality, a lack of foundational principles. Because if we all practiced the principle of non-aggression, then we would live in a moral society. If we all practiced the principle of not initiating force against other people to steal what is theirs, then we would have a better society. And people, because they've been distorted, because society lacks morality, people have been convinced that giving the government more altruistic powers is how you make society a better place. But what they're actually doing is further eroding the morality of society. Every time you give government more ability to initiate force, you are making society a less and less moral place. And that's why, as systems become less capitalistic, as countries devolve into Venezuela, North Korea, people become less free and less free. People become poorer and poorer because they live in less moral societies. And once you give the government more and more authority, the government, which is immoral by its nature, predicated on the use of force, does everything they can to squash down the individual, anyone that might be a threat. And that's why in these societies, you always see freedom of speech go, you've always seen the right to bear arms go, because the government gains power, they're already immoral, and they take away anyone's ability to get ahead in life, because anyone's ability to get ahead is a threat to the immoral people that hold government power. So in Venezuela, you see equality in poverty in that everyone's starving to death, yet you see a ruling class who lives in the lap of luxury. And you see that in North Korea, and you saw that in the Soviet Union, and you saw that under Mao in China. Society's problem is that we no longer have morality. Capitalism is just free and voluntary exchange, and someone like me, who lives their life based around moral principles, who lives their life to spread logic, reason, and philosophy, will do no harm in this world. But if I lacked moral principle, then what I would do is I would gather up the talking points of the political establishment, and I would make very powerful arguments in favor of the establishment, and I would use my ability to talk about historical information, to use philosophy. I would use that as a sophist, and then I would show that to those in power and let them know that for the right price, I could help further their cause. Because my actions would be predicated on immorality. Society's problem is morality. And by the way, if that happened, I would help the government in their quest to convince people that altruism is morality, which would ultimately increase government power, lead to less overall wealth being generated, lead to the abolishment of upward mobility, and no longer have where people are being alleviated out of poverty, and the poverty floor wouldn't be increased. Society's problem is that people have lost their moral principles. That moral principles are not taught at a young age. Instead, we have given our children's minds to the hands of the government, who purposely distort moral principles to convince young people that the initiation of force, that altruism is morality, when in reality, the initiation of force can only be defined as immoral. And a system that allows for free and voluntary exchanges, there's nothing more moral than that.